All right, let's jump into today's deep dive. We're taking a look at this pretty interesting article from Bisnow. It's called Election 2024. Here's everything that's at stake for CRE. And, it's just published on November 1st. So it's got all the latest info as we head into, this big election. And, we always hear about how these election years, they cause a bunch of uncertainty in the markets and that it tends to slow down those, big real estate deals. But this article actually points out some pretty interesting data that suggests that, maybe it's not always the case. So what's the reality here? Is this election going to be different? And how are these candidates' platforms really, actually impacting commercial real estate? I think it's time to unpack all of this.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the Bisnow article cites data that shows that historically, elections haven't really caused these major dips in CRE transactions.
Oh, okay. So that's kind of surprising. So then why does this idea of a slowdown persist? It's like everyone just assumes deals are going to completely freeze up during an election year.
Yeah, there is this general perception of uncertainty, I think. And, people in commercial real estate are definitely paying attention to what policies the new administration might end up implementing.
Yeah.
Which could, of course, affect their investments. But this year, in particular, you've also got to factor in some very real economic anxieties. We've got inflation, interest rates, and those sort of, lingering effects from the pandemic. And all of those things combined, I think, could be amplifying that sense of caution that's out there.
So you've got this historical data that might not actually, reflect the current mood. And then on top of that, we've got all these economic concerns that everyone's thinking about. It really does make you wonder if those old patterns will actually hold true this time around. Speaking of things that people are concerned about, let's talk about one of the, hottest topics on the campaign trail right now. That's also a huge issue for commercial real estate, housing.
Absolutely. It's no secret that housing affordability is a massive concern for voters, especially in certain key swing states. And, both Trump and Harris have really put it front and center in their campaigns. But their proposed approaches are, pretty distinct.
Yeah, for sure. And the Bisnow article goes into how Trump's platform leans pretty heavily towards deregulation, specifically when it comes to zoning laws. He really wants to simplify things, just make it easier to build. And his supporters often point to Project 2025 as a potential roadmap for how that might actually work. Now, just to clarify for our listener, Project 2025 is basically it's a policy document that was put together by some conservative think tanks, and it outlines these potential policy changes that a future Republican administration might pursue.
And a key aspect of that document is this push for more single-family zoning, which, could have huge implications for anyone who's involved in multifamily projects when it could incentivize sprawl and make it more difficult to develop denser, more urban housing.
On the other side, you've got Harris, and she seems to be focusing more on tax incentives to encourage the creation of affordable housing, particularly in urban areas. But it's interesting, though, because the article also raises this, really thought-provoking question. How much power does a president actually have over housing policy in the U.S.?
That's right. It's a good question.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as just, signing an executive order and making things happen. Congress plays a huge role in actually shaping housing policy. And, getting any legislation passed requires navigating a lot of political hurdles.
True. But the president's influence shouldn't be underestimated either. They can set the agenda and put pressure on lawmakers to prioritize certain issues. And this issue of housing is especially potent in those crucial swing states. The Bisnow article points out that, on average, renters in those states are earning 17% less than what they actually need to afford the median rent. And that's a significant gap, and those voters are going to be very tuned in to each candidate's proposals on this issue.
Absolutely. Now, another interesting aspect of this election that the article explores is campaign finance. Who's putting their money behind each candidate in the commercial real estate world, and what might that tell us?
Okay, let's get into that. Because it seems like there have been some pretty interesting shifts in donations over the course of this campaign.
Yeah, well, according to the article, Trump initially had a big lead in donations that were coming from real estate entities. His supporters within the industry felt that his policies, particularly those focused on economic growth, would be, more beneficial to their interests.
So basically it was all about the bottom line.
Pretty much, yeah. But then as Harris's campaign started to gain momentum, she started to close that gap in donations. Now, the article suggests that some of those contributions might have been driven more by opposition to Trump than by, enthusiastic support for her specific policies. It's possible that some donors in the CRE world were hedging their bets
Interesting. So even though they may not have been completely on board with all of her policies, they still wanted to make sure they had a seat at the table if she won.
Exactly. And in the end, both candidates ended up with pretty comparable sums from the industry, which leads to a pretty thought-provoking question. What does this funding landscape really tell us about CRE's expectations for each candidate? Are they hedging their bets, or do they see both candidates as potentially beneficial? Or maybe even, equally risky to their interests?
Right. It almost feels like they're saying, look, we're not totally sure who's going to win, but we just want to make sure we're on good terms with whoever ends up in the White House.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Now, we can't talk about this election's impact on CRE without addressing the big elephant in the room, or maybe I should say the big economic indicator,
Yeah.
the overall state of the U.S. economy.
Yeah, that's absolutely the top concern for voters across the board, and it has a massive impact on commercial real estate.
For sure. And the article quotes economist Peter Linneman, who has a pretty interesting take on this whole thing. He says that both candidates are offering a sort of mixture of policies, and he believes that the economy will likely grow regardless of who wins.
What's intriguing about Linneman's perspective is that he's essentially saying that the election itself might not actually be the deciding factor when it comes to economic growth. And this really challenges that sort of, doom and gloom narrative that we often hear during election cycles.
It's a little bit of a contrarian view, isn't it? It's not necessarily about who wins, but more about the underlying economic forces at play.
Exactly. And that raises a question, I think, for our listener. If the election's impact on the economy might not be as decisive as we think, what other factors should we be focusing on? Where will the real opportunities and challenges lie for CRE in the coming years?
Okay, here's where things get even more interesting. Because the Bisnow article doesn't just stop at housing and the economy. It also digs into how this election could specifically impact the construction and office sectors, both of which are dealing with a lot of uncertainty right now.
Right. And these are areas where the next administration's policies could have a very direct impact.
Yeah, for example, when it comes to construction, the article highlights how Trump's immigration policies, if they're reinstated, could actually make the labor shortage in the industry even worse. And this is a major concern for developers who are trying to get projects completed on time and within budget.
And then you've got the question of what will happen with those huge manufacturing projects
Right.
that were spurred by the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act.
Right. And just to clarify for our listener, those acts were passed by Congress to incentivize domestic manufacturing, particularly in the semiconductor and clean energy sectors. They're expected to lead to a surge in construction projects, but the next administration's approach to these initiatives will be crucial in determining how they actually play out.
Absolutely. And then when we turn to the office sector, we've got a whole other set of questions swirling around.
Right. The federal government's office footprint is massive, and the next president's stance on remote work could really shake things up. If there's a push to bring federal employees back to the office, that could definitely create demand in certain markets. But if remote work continues to be the norm, it could lead to a surplus of office space, particularly in cities with a high concentration of government offices.
Yeah, that's a really interesting dynamic. And it's a good reminder that the impacts of this election are going to be felt very differently in different parts of the country.
Exactly. So let's zoom in a bit and look at some specific state and city examples from the article, because I think this is where it gets really relevant for you, the listener. These local dynamics can have a direct impact on your community, your investments, and even your daily life.
Absolutely. And as we dig deeper, I think it's important to remember that each state and each city has its own unique set of factors at play.
Definitely. So the Bisnow article highlights a few key examples, and one that really caught my eye was the situation in California. Voters there are going to be deciding on Proposition 33, which would make some changes to the state's rent control laws.
Now, this is definitely a contentious issue with strong opinions on both sides. It could have a huge impact on the rental market in California, and the outcome will be closely watched by investors and developers nationwide.
Then you've got Florida, where voters will be deciding whether to legalize recreational marijuana through Amendment 3. And this is another example of how a single ballot measure could have ripple effects across multiple sectors of the CRE industry.
Absolutely. Think about the potential demand for industrial space to, cultivate and process cannabis, for retail space, for dispensaries, and even the potential impact on tourism and hospitality. It could be a major boon for certain segments of the Florida real estate market. But it also raises questions. about how the industry will be regulated, what kind of zoning restrictions will be put in place, and how these changes might impact local communities.
Right. Even with, seemingly positive developments, there are always these complexities and potential downsides to consider. It's all about understanding the full picture and how all of these different factors kind of, play off of each other.
Absolutely.
Now, moving up the East Coast a bit, the Bisnow article points to New York, where there are several highly contested House races that could potentially shift the balance of power in Congress.
And those races are drawing a lot of attention from the CRE industry because they could influence federal policies on issues like taxation, infrastructure spending, and housing, all of which, directly impact real estate development and investment.
Then, heading down south, the article highlights an example from Houston, where there's a significant school bond on the ballot. And this bond has garnered a lot of support from the local CRE industry because it would provide funding for new school construction and renovations.
And this is a great example of how the interests of the CRE industry often align with broader community needs. Improving schools can boost property values and attract new residents and businesses to an area.
So it really does create this sort of win-win situation for both the community and the real estate market.
Exactly. And I think that's a key takeaway from all of these local examples. The 2024 election isn't just some, abstract national event.
Yeah.
It has very real and tangible consequences for communities and for the people who live and work in those communities.
Well said. And it's clear that this election is shaping up to be, particularly unique and potentially volatile for the CRE industry.
Absolutely. We've got this, fascinating mix of historical patterns that might not hold true this time around, combined with all these economic uncertainties that are making everyone just, a bit more cautious.
And it's all playing out against the backdrop of these major policy debates and local dynamics that we've been discussing. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's one thing you want our listener to keep in mind as they continue to follow the election and its impact on CRE?
I think the most important thing is to remember that this is really just the beginning. The next few weeks leading up to the election are going to be crucial, and the results will have ripple effects that will be felt for years to come.
And we'll be here to help you make sense of it all. So stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll explore some of the specific challenges and opportunities that commercial real estate professionals and investors might face in the wake of this election.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the 2024 election and all the ways it's, intertwined with commercial real estate. Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground already, from that national economic outlook to those specific local issues that could really, have a big impact on your community.
And as we kind of dig deeper into these local dynamics, I think it's really interesting to think about how they might interact with those, broader national trends that we were just discussing. So, for example, we were talking about, Trump's focus on deregulation, particularly when it comes to housing, versus, Harris's emphasis on tax incentives. So what happens when those federal policies clash with local priorities?
That's a great point. Imagine a city that has, strong tenant protections in place, like rent control. And then a federal policy comes along that aims to loosen those restrictions or, incentivize a different type of housing development. You could end up with a real tug of war between federal and local authorities.
And that puts CRE investors and developers right in the middle of it all. It's like they're trying to navigate these two different sets of rules and regulations, which can create a lot of, uncertainty and risk.
Oh, absolutely. And then on top of all of that, you have to layer on those economic factors that we were talking about earlier, like interest rates and inflation. Those are top of mind for everyone right now. But, those forces can play out very differently depending on the local market.
Right. So a national policy aimed at, curbing inflation, for example, might actually have unintended consequences in a city that's already experiencing a slowdown in CRE investment. It could actually, exacerbate the problem rather than solving it.
Exactly. It really underscores the need for a nuanced understanding of both the national picture and the local context. When you're making decisions about, CRE investments, there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
And speaking of local context, one of the examples from the Bisnow article that I found, particularly thought-provoking was the situation in Florida with the potential legalization of recreational marijuana.
Ah, yes, Amendment 3. That's a fascinating case study because it really shows how, a single ballot measure can have these ripple effects across multiple sectors of the CRE industry.
Yeah, if it passes, you could see this huge surge in demand for industrial space to cultivate and process cannabis, as well as retail space for dispensaries. It could even impact the hospitality sector, as Florida potentially, becomes a destination for cannabis tourism.
And it's not hard to imagine certain areas of Florida experiencing a real estate boom if Amendment 3 passes.
Mm.
But it also raises a lot of important questions.
For sure, like how will this new industry be regulated? What about zoning restrictions? And how will these local communities respond to this influx of new businesses and residents?
Those are all, crucial considerations for
Right.
anyone who's thinking about investing in the Florida market. And it's just a good reminder that even with seemingly positive developments like this, there are always, complexities and potential downsides to consider.
You got to look beyond the hype and really understand the potential risks as well as the reward.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to this idea of staying informed and engaged. As we've seen, this 2024 election isn't just about who sits in the Oval Office. It's about the policies they enact, the ripple effects those policies have, and how those ripples ultimately reach the shores of your own community and your own investments.
Well said. So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's one key takeaway you want our listener to walk away with?
I think the most important thing is to remember that this is a dynamic and evolving situation. This election is just one piece of a very complex puzzle, and the pieces are still moving. Meaning that we need to stay flexible, adaptable, and open to new information. Don't get too caught up in the headlines or the predictions. Instead, just focus on understanding those, underlying trends, the local nuances, and the potential risks and opportunities that are emerging.
So, it's all about being proactive, doing your research, and making informed decisions based on the best available information.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Challenge your assumptions and seek out diverse perspectives. The more informed you are, the better equipped you'll be to navigate all those complexities of the CRE landscape in the years to come.
Great advice. And speaking of diverse perspectives, in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. We'll explore some of the long-term implications of this election and what it all means for the future of commercial real estate. So stay tuned for part 3. And we are back for the final part of our deep dive, into the 2024 election and all of its impacts on commercial real estate.
Yeah, it really has been a whirlwind tour of those, national trends and the local dynamics and the potential, risks and rewards out there.
Absolutely. We've covered a lot of ground. And now as we look ahead, I'm really curious to get your take on those into longer-term implications of this election. For the CRE industry, what are the things that are really going to shape the landscape for, years to come?
Well, I think it's crucial to remember that these elections are really just one piece of a much larger puzzle. While the outcome, this November will certainly have an impact, it's not the only factor shaping the future of commercial real estate.
Okay, so what are some of the other pieces of that puzzle then?
Well, we've got economic trends, we've got technological advancements, those demographic shifts, a whole host of different forces at play that are all interconnected. So as we think about those, long-term effects of this election, we need to consider how it will interact with all of these other trends that are happening.
So it's not just about, who wins, but how the policies they implement,
Yeah.
economic climate they operate in, and all those broader societal changes that are happening all kind of come together.
Exactly. It's this complex ecosystem. But if I had to highlight a few key areas where I think, this election will have a lasting impact on CRE, I'd probably start with sustainability.
Okay, interesting. And why sustainability?
Well, climate change is a major concern. For, investors, developers, and tenants alike these days, it's not really a niche issue anymore. It's front and center in every aspect of real estate, really.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, both Trump and Harris have talked about addressing climate change in their campaigns, but they've definitely, proposed very different approaches.
Right, exactly. And the policies enacted by the next administration will have a significant impact on how the CRE industry adapts to those challenges and opportunities of a, more sustainable future. So, if there's a big push for renewable energy and energy efficiency, we could see these whole new markets emerge for those developers and investors who specialize in those areas.
So there's potential for real growth and innovation in that space?
Absolutely. But then, on the flip side, if we see stricter regulations around carbon emissions, it could actually make it more expensive to develop and operate certain types of properties. Older buildings might need significant upgrades to meet those new standards. And the cost of those upgrades could be prohibitive for some owners.
So it's this delicate balance between, encouraging those sustainable practices
Yeah.
and making sure that those practices are, economically viable for the industry.
Right, exactly. And then, of course, technology is another area where I think we'll see those lasting effects from this election. Prop tech is already transforming the CRE industry at a rapid pace.
Oh, yeah. We're seeing all sorts of innovations,
Uh-huh.
from those smart buildings and VR tours to,
Mhm.
data analytics platforms and blockchain-based transactions.
Exactly. And the policies of that next administration
Mm-hmm.
could either accelerate or hinder that transformation.
Yeah.
Investments in infrastructure,
Mm.
like expanding broadband access, could make it much easier for those CRE companies to adopt these new technologies.
But on the other hand, those regulations around data privacy and cybersecurity could create, new challenges and hurdles for companies that are operating in that space.
Right. It's always this balancing act
Yeah.
between fostering that innovation and ensuring, the responsible use of technology.
And, we can't forget about the human element in all of this. Demographics are changing, work patterns are evolving, and the way people live, work, and play is constantly being redefined.
And, all of that has implications for the types of spaces that, CRE developers are building
Mhm.
and the ways those spaces are actually being used. We're seeing this growing demand for mixed-use developments,
Hmm.
flexible workspaces,
Hmm.
and amenities that cater to a, more diverse and mobile workforce.
So it's not just about, building bigger and taller anymore. It's about creating these spaces that meet the evolving needs of the people who use them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As we think about that long-term impact of this election, we need to consider how it'll shape the future of our cities,
Mhm.
our communities, and ultimately, our lives.
That's a great point. It brings it all back down to, a very human level. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one final thought you want to leave our listener with?
I think, the key takeaway here is this. The future of commercial real estate is really being shaped by this complex interplay of forces, from those political decisions and economic trends to those, technological advancements and societal shifts. Staying informed, being adaptable, and being open to new possibilities will be essential for navigating the years ahead.
Well said. This has been such an incredibly insightful conversation, and I know our listeners walking away with a much deeper understanding of what's at stake in this election and how it could impact the CRE world. So as those results unfold in the coming weeks, keep those insights in mind. Stay curious and don't be afraid to ask those tough questions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive at